What most people misunderstand about avoidance is this idea that emotional distance equals emotional absence. It doesn't. In fact, in many cases, it's the exact opposite. When an avoidant begins to withdraw, it's rarely because they feel nothing. It's because they are feeling too much too fast, and they don't yet have the internal structure to hold it. Now think about that for a moment. Most people assume love looks like closeness, openness, and verbal expression. But psychologically, avoidant attachment operates on a completely different internal wiring. Their nervous system is not calibrated for sustained emotional intensity without triggering a threat response. So when intimacy begins to deepen, what feels like connection to one person feels like pressure to another. And pressure to an avoidant mind quickly translates into danger. So what do? They retreat. Not because they are heartless, but because they are overloaded. It's emotional self-regulation, just in a very indirect and often confusing form. They step back to regain control, to restore what feels like emotional safety, even if the bond itself is something they genuinely value. And this is where the paradox begins. Because while they are physically or verbally distancing themselves, internally, they are not disengaging. In fact, their mind is often more active during withdrawal than during closeness. They replay conversations. They analyze emotional cues. They try to understand what they are feeling without fully admitting that what they are feeling is attachment. This is why you cannot interpret avoidant behavior through a simple lens of they care or they don't care. That binary thinking collapses in front of real human psychology. Instead, what you are witnessing is a conflict between attachment and autonomy, between desire and fear, between emotional pull and self-protection. And here's something even deeper. Avoidants often don't trust emotional intensity, even when it's positive. To them, strong feelings are unpredictable, and anything unpredictable feels unsafe. So when they start to care about someone, they don't immediately move closer. They test distance first. They observe what happens when they pull away. Not because they want to play games, but because they are unconsciously asking a question. Will I still be safe if I let this matter to me? That withdrawal is not rejection, it is assessment. But from the outside, it feels like emotional coldness. It feels like disinterest. And that's where most people misread the situation and either chase harder or detach completely. Both responses miss the underlying truth, that emotional intensity in an avoidant does not move in a straight line. It moves in waves, expansion, then contraction, connection, then retreat. The key psychological insight here is that avoidants don't experience love as a steady state of openness. They experience it as a fluctuation they are constantly trying to regulate. So when they seem distant, the question is not, do they care? The more accurate question is, what did closeness activate inside them that made them step back to regain control? Because if there were no emotional activation, there would be no need for distance in the first place. And this is the part most people overlook. Indifference does not require regulation. Disconnection does not require strategy, but avoidance does. The very act of pulling away is evidence that something was felt strongly enough to manage. So when you see an avoidant withdraw, don't rush to interpret it as absence. Look at it as overflow, emotional overflow, that they are still learning how to contain, understand, and integrate without losing their sense of self. And if you understand that, you stop reacting to their distance as rejection and start seeing it for what it often is, a nervous system trying to protect something it doesn't yet know how to fully hold. Because in the end, emotional withdrawal is not the end of connection. Sometimes it's the beginning of its deepest test and its quietest form of truth. Now let's go a layer deeper, because if you really want to understand avoidant attachment, you have to stop looking at what they say in the moment and start tracking what they cannot consistently stop doing. Consistency is one of the most revealing psychological markers in human behavior. When someone is emotionally uninvolved, they don't struggle with presence or absence. They are simply indifferent. But when someone is avoidant and emotionally activated, you see something very different. You see contradiction. You see fluctuation. You see return after withdrawal. And that is where most people get confused. They assume inconsistency means lack of interest. But in avoidant psychology, inconsistency often means the opposite. It means there is something internally unresolved, something pulling them back even after they've tried to create distance. Because here's the truth. People do not return to what they do not feel anything for. Return is always a form of emotional evidence, even if it is unspoken, even if it is unintentional. An avoidant can disappear for days, sometimes even longer. They can go silent, act detached, and create emotional space that feels absolute. But then something shifts. A message appears, a reaction to a story, a casual check-in that seems too small to matter. But it matters precisely because it breaks their own pattern of detachment. That break-in pattern is not random. It is internal tension surfacing externally. What's happening underneath is a psychological tug-of-war. One part of them is saying, I need distance to feel safe. The other part is saying, I still feel connected and I need to confirm that connection still exists. So they oscillate between the two states, not because they are manipulative, but because they are trying to regulate emotional proximity without losing control of themselves. And this is where the deeper truth emerges. Avoidants don't move in straight emotional lines. They move in cycles. Approach, retreat, silence, reappearance, detachment, subtle reconnection. If there was no emotional attachment, there would be no cycle. There would simply be an exit. But cycles mean something is still active in the system, something unresolved, something that has not been fully shut down. And when you observe this pattern closely, you start to notice a very specific signature. They rarely return in a fully open emotional state. They come back indirectly, almost casually, almost as if nothing happened. But beneath that surface level normality, there is emotional tracking happening. They are checking if the bond is still accessible without fully stepping into vulnerability. That is why their return often feels understated. They don't say, I missed you directly. They re-enter through small doors, not big entrances, because big emotional declarations require the very thing they struggle with most, exposure. So instead, they test reconnection in low-risk ways. A message that doesn't demand emotional depth. A presence that doesn't require explanation. A subtle reappearance that allows them to feel close without feeling trapped. But here's the critical insight. Even these minimal returns are significant because emotionally disconnected people don't test proximity. They don't revisit emotional spaces they have truly left behind. Only someone who is still internally engaged keeps circling back. And this is where your perception has to sharpen. You stop interpreting behavior at face value and start reading behavioral patterns over time. One disappearance means nothing, but disappearance followed by return again and again, that is a pattern. And patterns always reveal emotional truth more accurately than isolated actions. So when you see an avoidant come back, don't rush to label it as confusion or convenience. Look at it as internal conflict resolving itself in small, controlled increments. They are not fully stepping in, but they are also not fully letting go. They are hovering in the space between attachment and avoidance, trying to find equilibrium without emotional exposure. And that tension between leaving and returning, between silence and reappearance, is often where their hidden emotional investment lives. Because in the end, indifference does not return. But unresolved attachment always does, even if it comes back quietly, even if it comes back indirectly, and even if the person experiencing it is still pretending to themselves that they are unaffected. Now let's talk about something most people completely underestimate in avoidant psychology: attention without expression. Because in healthy emotional dynamics, attention usually shows itself through engagement. You notice someone, you respond to them, you interact with them. It's visible, it's direct, it's easy to interpret. But with avoidance, attention operates in a far more concealed way. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't always translate into action. Instead, it becomes observational, quiet, persistent in the background. And this is where the shift happens. Because when an avoidant begins to emotionally invest, even slightly, they don't suddenly become expressive. They become observant. They start tracking you. Not in an obsessive or obvious way, but in a subtle psychological sense. They notice when you are online and when you are not. They pick up on changes in your tone. They remember details you mentioned casually once, even if they act like they didn't. They become more aware of your emotional rhythm than they are willing to admit, even to themselves. Now here's the key insight. Attention is always the first stage of emotional attachment. Before someone expresses love, they notice. Before they commit, they observe. Before they open up, they collect data. Emotionally speaking, attention is the groundwork of connection. But avoidants rarely move through this stage openly. They don't say, I'm thinking about you. Instead, they silently monitor your presence. And because they don't express it, most people misread it as absence. But absence of expression is not absence of attention. In fact, in avoidant behavior, silence often hides heightened awareness. The less they say, the more they may actually be internally processing. Because when emotional closeness begins to activate discomfort, They don't disconnect from perception. They disconnect from expression. They still see. They still notice. They still register your presence. They just stop revealing that they are doing so. And this is where psychology becomes very interesting, because selective attention without expression requires effort. It requires control. It requires the suppression of natural emotional output. And people don't suppress what they don't care about. So when an avoidant begins to quietly monitor your life, your patterns, your emotional state, it is not random curiosity. It is emotional engagement filtered through restraint. They are essentially saying without words, I see you, but I am not ready to show that I see you. And this creates a very unique dynamic, because on the surface, they appear detached. They may even act indifferent. But underneath that surface, there is an active internal map forming, an emotional mapping of your behavior, your consistency, your availability. And the more consistent you are, the more noticeable you become in their internal world. Not because you are trying to be noticed, but because consistency becomes psychologically significant to someone who expects emotional unpredictability. So while they may not reach out, they are still engaged. While they may not respond, they are still registering. While they may not express interest, they are still tracking emotional signals in the background. And this is where many people make a critical mistake. They assume that if someone is not expressing interest, there is no interest at all. But avoidant psychology breaks that assumption, because expression and attention are not always synchronized in them. Sometimes attention increases precisely when expression decreases. And if you understand that, you stop chasing visible signals and start recognizing invisible ones. You stop measuring emotional reality only by what is said, and you start observing what is consistently noticed, remembered, and internally tracked. Because in human psychology, sustained attention is never neutral. It always carries meaning. It always indicates relevance. It always points to emotional activation, even when the person experiencing it is trying very hard not to show it. So when an avoidant seems uninterested, but somehow always knows what's happening in your world, what you're doing, or when something changes in your presence, don't dismiss that as coincidence. It is not coincidence. It is connection, filtered through control. And in the end, the mind does not consistently track what the heart has fully abandoned. It only watches what still matters, even in silence. Let's go even deeper into something that separates surface level understanding from real psychological insight. How avoidants reveal themselves in fragments, not in full sentences. Because if you're expecting an avoidant to suddenly open up with emotional clarity, you're already misreading the system. That's not how their internal world is structured. They don't move from silence to full expression. They move from silence to controlled exposure, carefully measured, carefully limited, almost like they are testing how much of themselves they can reveal without feeling emotionally exposed. So instead of grand confessions or obvious emotional transparency, what you get are fragments. A small memory shared at an unexpected time. A random thought about something deeply personal, followed immediately by a shift in tone. A brief moment where they let you see something real, then quickly reestablish distance as if they've revealed too much. And if you don't understand this pattern, you'll dismiss it. You'll think it's insignificant. But psychologically, these fragments are not small at all. In fact, they are some of the most meaningful signals in avoidant behavior. Because for an avoidant, vulnerability is not a habit. It is a breach in their internal defense system. It doesn't happen easily. It doesn't happen casually. It happens when emotional pressure builds just enough to override their usual control mechanisms, but not enough to make them feel completely unsafe. So what comes out in those moments is not random. It is carefully unfiltered truth leaking through a highly controlled structure. And this is where you start to see the real architecture of emotional connection in avoidance. They don't reveal everything. They reveal pieces. A sentence here, a memory there, a confession that feels too personal for the moment it was shared in. And then, almost instinctively, they retreat back into control. But here is the key. People do not share fragments of their inner world with someone they feel nothing for. Fragmentation itself is a compromise between emotional expression and emotional fear. It is what happens when connection is real, but exposure is still threatening. So instead of asking why they don't open up fully, the better question becomes, why are these pieces coming out at all? Because emotionally detached individuals don't leak personal meaning. They stay neutral. They stay consistent in distance. But when someone begins to offer even small insights into their inner world, it means something has already bypassed their defenses. And that is where avoidants are most misunderstood. People think they are emotionally unavailable across the board, but in reality, they are selectively available. Not in volume, but in moments. Not in consistency, but in flashes of authenticity. And those flashes matter more than people realize. Because in human psychology, emotional truth rarely arrives in complete form at the beginning. It arrives in signals, in partial disclosures, in moments where control weakens just enough for authenticity to surface, even briefly. Now think about what it takes for someone who values control above emotional exposure to still choose to share something personal. It means the internal pressure of connection is rising. It means the emotional bond is strong enough that silence is no longer fully sustainable. But because full openness still feels unsafe, they compromise. They give you pieces instead of the whole. They allow glimpses instead of full visibility. And this creates a very specific emotional dynamic. You start to feel that there is more underneath what they are showing. And you are right. There is. But it is not accessible through force. It is only accessible through trust that develops slowly, in stages, over time. That's why pushing them to open up faster usually backfires. It triggers their defense system. It increases withdrawal. Because they are not resisting connection itself. They are resisting the loss of control that full exposure represents. So these small disclosures are actually their way of participating in connection without abandoning safety. It is their version of saying, I am here, but I am still protecting myself. And if you listen closely, you'll realize these moments often come at emotionally charged times, after distance, after silence, after internal processing. As if they return not with explanations, but with pieces of what they couldn't say while they were away. That is not randomness. That is emotional leakage under pressure. And once you understand that, you stop overlooking the small things. You stop waiting for big declarations. You start recognizing that in avoidant psychology, intimacy is not declared. It is revealed in fragments over time. Because in the end, someone who shares pieces of their inner world with you is not emotionally absent. They are emotionally negotiating how much of themselves they can safely allow you to see. Now let's talk about something that looks like contradiction on the surface, but is actually one of the clearest psychological signatures of avoidant attachment. The ability to create distance without truly disconnecting. Because most people assume connection is binary. Either someone is present or they are gone. Either they are engaged or they are not. Either they choose you or they leave you. But avoidant psychology does not operate in binaries. It operates in gradients, in partial presence, in controlled proximity. So what looks like emotional distance is often not emotional exit. It is emotional modulation. They don't leave the bond. They regulate how close they allow themselves to stay inside it. And this is where the confusion begins for most people. Because from your perspective, distance feels like disinterest. Silence feels like detachment. Reduced communication feels like loss. But from their perspective, that same distance is not abandonment of the connection. It is their way of preserving it without feeling overwhelmed by it. So you'll notice something very specific. They may pull away, reduce contact, become less expressive, less available, but they don't fully sever the thread. They don't erase the connection. They don't fully disappear from the emotional field. There is always a trace, a residual presence, a way back in. And psychologically, that matters. Because when someone is truly emotionally disengaged, they simplify the situation. They remove themselves completely. There is clarity in exit. There is closure in indifference. But avoidants rarely give you that clean closure when emotional attachment is present. Instead, they create ambiguity. Not always intentionally, but as a byproduct of internal conflict. Part of them wants closeness. Part of them wants space. So what you get is neither full presence nor full absence. You get controlled distance that still maintains emotional connectivity at a safe level. And here's the deeper layer. Even while they are pulling back, they are still monitoring the bond internally. They are still aware of its existence. They are still emotionally accounting for it in their own way. It doesn't vanish from their system just because they are not actively engaging with it. This is why you often see avoidants re-engaging after periods of distance. Not necessarily with intensity, but with continuity. A message that reopens the channel. A subtle return that reestablishes contact without fully explaining the absence. Almost as if they never truly left emotionally, even though they stepped away physically or communicatively. And this creates a very specific psychological tension. They can create the illusion of separation while maintaining an internal sense of connection. But here's the part that's crucial to understand. This is not manipulation in the traditional sense. It is regulation. It is self-protection. It is an attempt to manage emotional intensity without collapsing under it. Because for an avoidant, complete disconnection is not always emotionally neutral. Sometimes it feels like loss. And if something feels like loss, it means it still matters. So instead of fully detaching, they maintain a controlled version of the connection. Enough distance to feel safe. Enough proximity to not feel loss. And that's why you can't evaluate their emotional state based on surface level availability, because availability fluctuates, but underlying attachment patterns reveal themselves in persistence. Ask yourself this: do they ever truly disappear, or do they always leave a thread behind? Do they ever fully close the door, or do they leave it slightly open, even if they are not standing in it? Because that slightly open door is not random. It is psychological compromise. It is the mind attempting to balance fear of intimacy with fear of loss. And that balance is unstable. It shifts, it breaks, it reforms, which is why their presence in your life can feel intermittent but never fully erased. So when an avoidant stays connected while creating distance, what you are really witnessing is not confusion. It is containment. They are trying to contain emotional intensity within boundaries they can tolerate. And that is why their absence never feels complete. Because even in distance, something of the bond remains active. Not fully expressed, not fully denied, but quietly maintained in the background of their emotional world. And in the end, people don't keep partial connections alive unless those connections still carry emotional weight, no matter how carefully that weight is being managed. Now we arrive at the moment where everything becomes clear, not through theory, not through interpretation, but through emotional consequence. Because if you truly want to understand avoidant attachment, you cannot just observe how they behave when things are stable. You have to observe what happens when emotional security is threatened, when distance is no longer their choice, but a reality. When the connection they were carefully regulating begins to slip out of reach. And this is where the most important pattern emerges. An avoidant who is emotionally uninvolved remains unaffected by absence. There is no internal disturbance, no behavioral shift, no reactivation. But an avoidant who is emotionally invested reacts differently when you withdraw. Not always immediately, not always openly, but inevitably. Because loss activates something that control alone cannot suppress. Now here's what makes this dynamic so complex. They may not chase in the way people expect. They may not become emotionally expressive or dramatically vulnerable. That is not their pattern. But what they do instead is far more revealing if you understand how to read it. They reappear, sometimes subtly, sometimes indirectly, sometimes through channels that feel almost casual on the surface. But the timing is what matters, because it is rarely random. It is often triggered by emotional absence they can no longer ignore. And this is the turning point most people miss. They interpret silence as finality. But for an avoidant with emotional investment, silence is not final. It is destabilizing. Because remember, their system is built around controlled connection, not complete disconnection. So when your presence disappears entirely, something in their internal equilibrium begins to shift. The structure they were using to regulate emotional proximity is no longer there. And what replaces it is awareness. Awareness that something meaningful is no longer immediately accessible. Now, they won't always name that feeling. In fact, they often avoid naming it altogether. But behavior reveals what language suppresses. They start checking in. They reestablish contact in small ways. They observe whether the connection is still available. Not to fully step back in, but to confirm it has not been lost completely. And this is where the emotional truth becomes undeniable. Because people do not react to loss unless something mattered. Absence only creates movement when presence had value. But what makes this especially significant in avoidant psychology is the delay. The response is often not immediate. It can be slow, gradual, almost imperceptible at first, but it builds. A message, a reaction, a subtle re-entry into your emotional space. And psychologically, this delay is important. It shows that they are not reacting from impulse alone, but from internal processing. They are trying to regulate the discomfort of emotional absence in a way that does not compromise their sense of control. So instead of direct emotional pursuit, you see indirect reconnection. Not "I miss you" in words, but "I'm still here" in behavior. And here is the deeper layer. When they do re-engage, it is often not with emotional intensity, but with familiarity, as if they are trying to restore equilibrium without reopening vulnerability too quickly. They return to what feels known, what feels safe, what feels manageable. But the very act of returning tells you something essential. Because disengaged people do not re-enter emotional systems, they have fully exited. They do not circle back. They do not test access. They do not reopen contact unless something within them is still unresolved. And that unresolved element is attachment. So when you step back and look at the full pattern, withdrawal, distance, silence, followed by eventual reappearance, you are not looking at emotional randomness. You are looking at emotional regulation under pressure. You are looking at a system trying to reconcile fear of closeness with fear of loss. And the strongest sign of hidden emotional investment is not intensity. It is return. Because indifference does not come back. Closure does not reopen itself. But emotional attachment, even when suppressed, has a way of resurfacing when absence becomes too loud to ignore. And that is the final truth. When an avoidant reacts to losing you, even subtly, even indirectly, even without full emotional expression, what you are seeing is not confusion. It is connection breaking through control. And in the end, no one reacts to loss unless something inside them still recognizes value in what was lost. And when you step back and look at everything together, a very clear pattern emerges beneath all the confusion. Avoidants are not heartless. They are not emotionally absent in the way people assume. What you are actually witnessing is not a lack of feeling, but a struggle to regulate feeling. Every behavior you've heard about, withdrawal, silence, inconsistency, fragmentation, distance while staying connected, is not random. It is the architecture of a nervous system trying to protect itself from emotional overwhelm while still staying attached to what matters. And this is the paradox most people never fully understand. The more someone tries to control closeness, the more obvious it becomes that closeness exists internally. Because you don't regulate what you don't feel. You don't create strategies around what has no emotional weight. You don't return to what has no meaning. So the real question was never, do they care or not? The real question is, how does someone express care when their entire system is built around fear of exposure? And once you understand that, you stop chasing surface-level signals. You stop misreading silence as absence. You stop confusing emotional restraint with emotional emptiness. Instead, you begin to see the deeper reality that attachment doesn't always look like openness, and love doesn't always look like closeness. Sometimes it looks like distance that never fully disconnects. Sometimes it looks like silence that still pays attention. Sometimes it looks like fragments instead of full truths. And sometimes it looks like someone who leaves, but never fully stops coming back in one form or another. But here's the final truth that ties everything together. When someone is truly emotionally unaffected, you don't see complexity. You see simplicity. You see exit without return. You see silence without tracking. You see absence without internal reaction. Complexity is the